Howdy hey, howdy ho. I am Layman Kingsford, and this is GAYme Speak, where I just talk about some of my inspirations for writing and creating tabletop games, talk about game design. This week, I am going to talk about fantasy. Means sword and sorcery stuff, wizards, dragons, castles, um, not damsels in distress. That's garbage. Um, but high fantasy, epic fantasy, saga fantasy. And I'm going to talk about some of the inspirations for both my own writing and game design from the fantasy genre. So it all begins, probably for many, if not most of us, with Lord of the Rings. I started reading that in fourth grade. Loved this series, even though my parents said, "Oh, are you sure you're ready for that?" Loved it. My dad ended up bringing me from a business trip, bringing me and this was like the early '80s, the box of the basic set for Dungeons and Dragons. He didn't even know what it was, but he saw it had wizards and dragons. I'd been reading Lord of the Rings, so he thought, little did he know what he started for my whole lifelong creative career. But so thanks, Dad. I've also recently discovered a YouTuber, Daniel Green, whose whole YouTube channel is all about fantasy and science fiction, and his passion for reading and now writing. So he talks about all his favorite series and things he's reading. He reviews them, ranks them. The maps from the worlds, the magic systems, the authors, the settings, all that sort of stuff. And I've actually found he's sort of reinvigorated some stuff for me and inspired a whole bunch of things for me to get really digging back into the fantasy stuff. On top of which is good timing because we've got a Living Empires story. For those of you who don't know, Living Empire or Living Saga is this big, massive, both stories and tabletop game project I've been working on for well over a decade, but it's really like coming together these days. But it's Living Fantasy or Living Empires, sorry, which is the fantasy setting where the story, the saga, all begins on this one world. It's got magic stuff, and it's got your elves and dwarves and goblins and trolls and humans and swords and magic things happening. And it evolves. The story evolves, comes to a culmination. Skip 1,000 years, get to Living Metropolis. The world is sort of like our contemporary world. We're going to have some superhero stories, and in that world, that story comes to a culmination, and we skip 1,000 years or something. We get to Living Starship and see how what's happened on the planet there, how they've gone and populated the galaxy. So it's one big continuous thing. You get to play games, follow the storyline by reading the stories, or by playing the games. You even get to create your own sort of alternate reality version of the world and the setting and the characters, or even in many cases create your own characters for it. And this Daniel Green has just really helped me refocus. And I don't get a lot of time to do a lot of reading anymore, at least not like I used to. So being able to watch him talk about and summarize some of these things, but I didn't know this author was happening. They were doing these sorts of stuff, and it's so cool. It should be no surprise that a lot of themes that are going to play out in the games, and in particular in the stories, are some LGBTQ plus themes, some very underrepresented characterization and activity and romances that we don't see very much of in epic fantasy or science fiction. Certainly changing these days, but making it something of a focus. I don't know if maybe it is a focus on our stuff, but it's certainly it's going to be far more prevalent in my works than it is in other stuff. So, yay. If it's not your cup of tea, go have some coffee. Speaking of which, I need some soon. But some of my other inspirations, once I got through Lord of the Rings, then I just started devouring all the fantasy. Not a whole lot, as a kid, not a whole lot of science fiction, but all the fantasy I could find. You went through C.S. Lewis's Narnia Chronicles, Lloyd Alexander's Prydain Chronicles. That's a series that I believe Disney. I mean, Disney holds the rights to it, and they had a horrible animated version of the Black Cauldron. Um, so I'm hoping that gets reinvigorated, and maybe they do a cool live action series or something with it, or set of movies. That would be exciting. Um, what other stuff did I read? But other stuff I did. Something that was extremely impactful and influential for me was the Dragonlance series. I first gravitated to it because it came from Dungeons and Dragons stuff, of which I was a passionate player. And even though going back and reading that as an adult, I read it probably dozens, the main books. I read them probably dozens of times as a kid, but reading them as an adult, the writing is not great. But I think I read those books at a time in my life when that to me is sort of so much of the heart of and passion I have for fantasy, despite the prose. But I love the world they created, the characters. Well, admittedly, two-dimensional and cliche in some cases. Um, I just love the Dragonlance stuff, and it still to this day has an impact upon me. Um, there was the Belgariad by David Eddings. Read that a ton of times. That was an interesting magic system where you could just sort of use your will to literally do almost anything, but you had to use a word to focus that thing. It's called The Will in the Word. Again, not great writing in terms of prose, and exceedingly two-dimensional characters. But I loved them because I read it in that time frame when I guess maybe really impressionable, sort of pre-teen, early teen years. But I did love those. And the Terry Brooks, Shannara books. Terry Brooks, Shannara books. Those are, by contemporary standards, very derivative. But I enjoyed them for whatever reason. Those were ones I sort of read once, I think, one and done, and I've never kept up with them beyond the sort of the original 5, 6, 7 books maybe that I read of it. But they're certainly in the industry influential. There's a TV series that had a couple seasons. It was all right. I think it had a couple seasons. Other series, then eventually, the first book, Robert Jordan's first book, Eye of the World, from his Wheel of Time series, came out. It was late high school for me, so mid to late 80s, I want to say. At least that's when I first noticed the book. It was a long time before I bought it. So I kept seeing it on the shelf for like a year or something, and eventually it came out in paperback, and so I bought it. And mind-blowing. The first 3, 4, 5 books in that series I thought were really establishing a new thing in fantasy, a new methodology, not methodology, sort of exploring, especially the first book or two, a lot of derivative. You can see where his inspirations came from, but then he took it in some new directions and was building this massive world, and I loved it. Sadly, apparently, fans who call it the slog. There's a middle section of books. They say it's 3, arguably 4 books. My personal opinion, I'd say after probably books 6 through 11. For me, man, I've never even been able to go back and reread those, sort of plow through them, and as they went along, I could even almost skip chapters. It was just read a sentence in every paragraph because so little is happening. Robert Jordan got so bogged down in describing the world rather than telling the story, which in the long run certainly provides for a richly detailed fictional world. So it's one of those that maybe I'll have to go back and dig my way through again. It's been a very long time, and I was so happy when Brandon Sanderson was selected to finish the series after Robert Jordan's sad death, because by that time I'd fallen in love with Brandon Sanderson and his writing and his Cosmere series and his unique, I'm going to use the word unique, magic systems that he crafts for each of these things. They were so cool and different. I enjoy many, if not most, of the characters Brandon Sanderson creates for his whole Cosmere series. And so when I saw that he was going to take over and finish Robert Jordan's massive epic, which it was 14 books, 15 with a prequel, which I don't think I've ever read. But I thought Brandon Sanderson did an admirable job of capturing the same tone, wrapping up massive epic and storylines and characters, bringing most of it to a satisfying conclusion. And I was just happy to see it concluded. So I have to agree that certainly that the Eye of the World, the Wheel of Time series is sort of a landmark establishment of what many of us now call contemporary fantasy. Is it my favorite? No, I'm excited for the TV series because I'm hoping, well, you have to with the visual medium and budgetary restraints. It's going to take the meat of those stories and those characters, develop them, and hopefully flesh them out even further. Because I found many of the female characters to be somewhat two-dimensional, and a lot of this is my memory of it, and again, upon rereading, I might have different opinions, and Daniel Green certainly has refreshed. I've watched some of his stuff about Wheel of Time, because it's his #1 epic, don't touch it, my favorite thing in the world. Respect to that. I just remember a lot of the female characters being so shrewish, especially to each other, and the romantic relationships, for the most part, are horribly, not even two-dimensional, really one-dimensional in my memory. None of them stand out as, oh, those are epic romances for the times. But yeah, someday when I have a spare hot 3 minutes to reread that entire 14-book series, we'll see. Because I would like to revisit it. But for me, in terms of contemporary fantasy or modern fantasy, not things that are set in modern times, but are written with different perspective on the genre and writing itself, and that are not derivative Tolkien clones, is for me #1, end all be all, is The Malazan Book of the Fallen by Steven Erikson, co-created with Ian Esselmont, whose books I do like as well, and I think he's a much more approachable writer in his prose. But they created this massive epic world that I think pretty much on the same scale as Wheel of Time and Lord of the Rings, massive epic thing. And for me, I really feel like reading those stories, you feel entrenched in the history of the world. You can see it, smell it, touch it, dig down in a few layers of dirt, and you uncover another civilization, and a sentence or paragraph about one thing in one book ends up being like the central focus and characters of a further book down the line. The scope of what they created is absolutely mind-boggling and mind-blowing to me. And every time I read anything of that series, or pretty much anything by Erikson himself, it literally inspires me to go, oh, I want to write. And then I'm writing, like, I don't sound as good as Erikson, and it's frustrating. But, so for me, that has set the gold standard of fantasy, and in many ways, and I've seen this in commentary and blogs by other Malazan fans, that it's sort of ruined the genre for us, because I read anything else, I'm kind of going, it's just doesn't satisfy in the same way, unless it's distinctly different in tone or creation. Somebody like Stephen Brust, B-R-U-S-T, Brust. I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce his last name. I think it's Brust. He does some great just character work, and there's witticism in his writing. It's the Taltosh Assassin series. He's got a fascinating world that he doesn't dive into. It doesn't give you a whole bunch of details about the world. You don't need it, because it's about these fun characters and this plot, and then it's set in the same world, but like earlier in its history. Some books that are clear and brazen adaptations of the Three Musketeers and stuff, and I just love his dialogue and prose and stuff in that. So unless you're doing something distinctly different, Erikson / Esselmont have sort of have jaded me even further to the genre of fantasy, just because to me that's the end all be all, and it'll take a lot, if ever in my lifetime, reading something else that surpasses that for me. Not saying it can't and won't happen. Just I haven't found anything yet that measures up to quite the same pinnacle for me. And this is all subjective, of course. Some things about the fantasy genre that I enjoy are the magic, of course, and the world building. Though certainly as I've gotten older and more sophisticated in my reading, I don't want what was traditional in fantasy, these just pages and pages or even chapters of just information dumps. The characters come to the elven forest and the elven land, and all of a sudden the story stops, and you just get all of this information about the elves, what they eat, what their festivals are, what they wear, who they've been at war with forever. Don't need that. Just tell me the story and show me the world as the characters you're giving us explore or experience the world themselves. I'll figure it out. Don't need your hand holding, thanks. That's where these days with the internet, also the bigger series publishing publishing like almanacs and that sort of stuff, or having websites dedicated to all that information. Something we're doing with Living Empires for sure, well, the whole Living Saga, is that don't want to be spending a whole lot of time giving you minutia of the worlds and the setting. If you're the sort of reader or fan that wants to dive into that stuff, we're going to give it to you, through websites and other information, hopefully printed books as well, where you can dive in and find out all those details. Otherwise, I just want to be showing you these characters, telling their stories, and getting the plot, keep it plugging along. And now some people want to sit and read and be swept away by all those world details. I'm still going to default to plot and character, show you the world when it's relevant to the plot and character in the moment. Otherwise, fill in the details yourself. May not be accurate. Who cares? It's your experience to have. I'm just helping cultivate a narrative experience for you. So, I guess that's kind of where I'm going to leave it. And, last thing, magic in fantasy. Can't really, it's arguable. Can't really have fantasy, what I would term as high fantasy, without some sort of magic system, whether it's the hard magic where you've got strict rules and it's massively complex, or you've got soft magic where it's kind of, they can cast fireballs. How? Who cares? They say a word and it happens. There's hard magic, there's soft magic, there's things in between. I think I fall somewhere sort of in between, where I don't, even though I would love to detail all the rules and come up with the rules, it's so challenging at that point, especially when you're creating something massive and epic. If you've got rules that are only going to apply to one book rather than, who knows how many books and tabletop games and stuff. Don't want to create all these rules and have something down the road sort of like, ooh, that sort of negates the reality or the truth of stuff that happened before, because that breaks everything and I didn't see that. That's the downside to hard magic systems, unless you got everything strictly plotted out, planned out, and you understand what all the rules are and all the implications are to your world. That's rough. Whereas soft magic, same thing in science fiction. What do they use for fuel for faster than light? Something like Star Wars. I'm not a big Star Wars fan. I don't know what fuel they use because they never talk about it. Ships just go. And they go fast when they need to go fast. They go faster than light when they need to go faster than light, and they can fly through atmospheres when they need to fly through atmospheres. Unlike more hard science fiction, like The Expanse, where I'm not going to come up with an example at the moment, but where the actual science of stuff is part of the grit of the story, and it's part of the plot too. Well, we've got to get fuel. We're going to run out of fuel. We've got gravity we have to deal with. Most science fiction, gravity and acceleration, who cares? Just they're on their ship. They can walk around like normal. Don't really need to explain it. Same thing with magic, soft magic systems. Magic happens because of this, and you have some loose guidelines, loose to slightly more strict guidelines. But it's not there. You're not there to understand the magic system. You're there to experience the setting and the characters and the effects of the magic, not the hows and whys of magic necessarily. But with Living Empires, I think we're walking the line between hard and soft magic. And that's kind of the point of it, which you'll understand when you start reading some stories. We're going to be releasing some content very soon. And we've got an exciting project working on a children's book, which I never, ever, ever thought I would do, but utilizing the setting and some of the themes and concepts from Living Empires. And as usual, there's going to be a very apparent skin of the LGBTQ plus resonance and representation in my stories, because that's something that we've seen very little of. It's getting better and better these days, both in what's dramatized for TV and movies and what's written in books. Certainly more of that in books for sure. But I'm putting it not just on the sleeve, but hardcore. It's not going to be hardcore in the way you're thinking. If you're thinking porn, it's not that. But certainly thematically, right up front, not hiding it, embracing different elements of it that many of us we'd have to sort of read between the lines, or you'd have secondary, tertiary characters that are gay or lesbian or bi or something, and we just have to sort of live through the lives of the straight characters we're given. Well, hey, we're gonna have plenty of characters for our LGBTQ plus people in my stuff. And I think that's about all I've got to say today. It's my little ramble on fantasy, what's inspired me, little tidbits of what we're doing with Living Empires. So whether you're reading, whether you're rolling dice, drawing cards, or moving meeples, just read and game on, and we'll see you next time. I'm Layman Kingsford. Ciao.